The snow fell in silence, blanketing the black forest in a thick white veil. Not even the ravens stirred. From the edge of the pines, where the last of the daylight burned red behind distant ridgelines, a dozen figures emerged. Norse warriors, tall, fur-clad, and armed, their boots broke through the snow crust with each careful step. They were not raiding this time, not plundering some Saxon monastery or coastal Frankish village. This was something else, a scouting party, a warning mission, a search for a trade outpost rumored to lie beyond the White Forest. Their leader, a man named Thorgils Bjarnarsson, bore a long scar from brow to jaw, a mark earned in the halls of Paris. But even he, a veteran of raids from the Irish Sea to the Dnieper, paused before the wall of trees. "No fire tonight," he muttered, "and no songs." His men exchanged glances. It was unlike him to fear anything. Yet the trees ahead, those endless pine sentinels of the north, stirred a dread deeper than swords or sorcery. For these were no ordinary woods. These were the edges of Biamian, the forest beyond the known, a place spoken of only in whispers by Norse traders and seers alike. The realm of the Biamians. The sagas would not name them directly. Instead, they hinted, those who walk where no trail lies, or they who see without being seen. But among the seasoned raiders who had once survived the cold marches north of Finnmark, a name had emerged, the Watchers. Thorgils had never met one, not truly, but he had seen the aftermath. A year before, another band, 15 men, led by his cousin Ulf, had crossed these same woods. They had hoped to reach a seasonal trading site spoken of by Finno-Ugric fishermen, a place where rare furs, ivory, and even amber could be traded without blood. They never returned. Only Ulf's second in command, Ragnar Skaldai, stumbled back. He came crawling from the frost after 6 days alone, his face frozen with a silence he never broke. He died within a fortnight, uttering just 5 words. No trace of the others was ever found, only their footprints in the snow, ending at a frozen riverbank where no river flowed. Some claimed the ice itself had swallowed them. Others said they had been marked by spirits, wolves of the forest in the shape of men. But Thorgils was no child to be frightened by fairy stories. Or so he told himself. Still, as the dusk deepened, he ordered the men to form a silent circle, weapons in hand, backs to each other. No fire, no warmth, only watchfulness. Above, the pines swayed gently. No wind blew. And from somewhere deep in that endless forest, where white trees grew so close, no moonlight passed between them, came a sound. Not a growl, not a howl, just the faint snap of a twig. Nothing followed. No movement, no figures, not even a bird stirred. But the 12 warriors of the north tightened their grip on sword and axe. And in that silence, heavier than snow, deeper than night, they began to feel it. The sensation of being observed, not by beasts or men, but by the forest itself. The Norse, for all their bravado, feared one thing above all, an enemy who would not fight on their terms, not in open field, not even in ambush, but one who would watch, wait, and unmake them piece by piece. These were not the Danes' kind of warriors. They were something older. To understand the terror that crept beneath Viking steel, that gnawed at the edges of their boldness like rot in a wooden beam, one must leave behind the known world, past the reach of longships, beyond the winding rivers of the east and the frostbitten fjords of the west. There lies a land where maps fade into blankness, and even the sagas grow silent. The Norse called it Biamian, the White Forest, a borderland not marked by mountains or sea, but by a change in the air itself, a land not conquered, but respected or feared. Its true inhabitants, the Biamians, were not a kingdom in the sense the Norse understood. They raised no longhouses, forged no axes to trade in distant markets, built no ships, left behind no sagas carved in runestones or sung in hall feasts. Yet to the Viking mind, they were not savages. They were something else. Masters of a realm the Norse could barely survive in, much less rule. The Biamians were forest people, semi-nomadic, adapted not just to the terrain but fused with it. They were of the taiga, like the lynx and the spruce and the wind that moves between snow-heavy boughs. To outsiders they appeared as ghosts, silent, sudden, and gone. Their footprint was a shallow depression in the snow that filled in minutes. Their villages were invisible to strangers, clusters of sod-covered shelters, or hide tents nestled into the contours of the land, vanishing when viewed from even a few paces away. Who were they? Archaeologists now believe the Biamians were ethnically and culturally related to the Finno-Ugric and Sami peoples, but distinct in their ways, isolated by geography and chosen tradition. Their society was less hierarchical than the Norse. They had no kings, no ills, no long feasting halls. Leadership flowed like water given to the wisest hunter, the most skilled tracker, or the shaman whose breath could still the wounded. Their gods lived in trees, in animals, in rivers that sang in the night. They carved no idols, but left offerings, bones lashed with bark, feathers stitched into patterns on reindeer hide, blood splashed on lichen-covered stones. They were not warriors in the Viking sense. They did not charge into battle for glory, but when threatened, they did not hesitate. They did not defend. They disappeared, and then returned, only to kill. Vikings, for all their skill and ferocity, depended on space, on mobility, on visible targets, on rhythm and momentum. Their greatest terror was to be trapped, to lose the initiative. And the Biamians did not fight to be seen or remembered. They fought to erase. Travelers' accounts from the 10th century, mostly Arab and Byzantine merchants, who dared accompany Norse traders, described the white-eyed forest people who spoke little and moved like deer. Some chroniclers called them sorcerers. Others called them demons. But there is no evidence that the Biamians saw themselves as anything other than human, just not the kind of human the Norse could understand. Their tools were simple bows of horn and birch, knives shaped like crescent moons, skis carved with patience from fur, and soaked in animal fat to glide on snow. Their shelters breathed with them, warm in the bitterest cold, invisible beneath a storm. They did not build fences. Their boundary was silence, and when the Norse came not to raid, but to trade, or map, or test their luck, they crossed into a world that did not share their rules. A saga fragment discovered near Trondheim tells of a Viking band who set up camp 2 days into the Biamian woods. On the third night, their firewood vanished, then their food, then their sentries. One by one they vanished. No sound, no blood, just absence. One survivor, found weeks later wandering near the coast, spoke only one word before dying. Hwitter, the white ones. Heva, the white ones. But the Biamians wore no white cloaks. The whiteness was the snow, the sky, the silence. They did not need to wear terror. They let the forest wear it for them. It was not in the Viking spirit to turn away from land. Their longships had scraped the shores of 100 kingdoms. They had carved settlements into the green folds of Ireland, burned monasteries along the coast of Francia, and even claimed icy footholds in Greenland's hostile rock. The Norse were explorers, raiders, farmers, and colonizers. Wherever their sails reached, they established presence, power, legacy, but not here, not in Biamian the White Forest. Here, their reach faltered, and their resolve cracked. The sagas are curiously silent about this failure. No great battles are recounted, no heroic last stands, no blood eagle rituals or defiant oaths before Odin. Instead, we find absence, gaps in maps, vague references to unsettled lands, trade routes that veer sharply away from the north. But the archaeological record tells a different story. In the soil near the White Sea, Norse tools have been found: rusted axe heads, broken sword hilts, iron arrow points snapped mid-flight. But they lie alone, not among settlement remains. No longhouses, no store pits, no smithies, only shattered weapons, burned leather, and bones scattered beneath the moss. Viking bones. Whatever was attempted in those woods, it ended not in conquest, but in quiet erasure. Unlike the open fields of England or the riverbanks of the Rus, the forest offered no clear targets. The Biamians had no halls to pillage, no herds to steal, no ships to burn. Their value lay in trade pelts, ivory, herbs, and secrets of the land. But when pushed, they did not fight to hold. They fought to disappear. And in doing so, they made it impossible for the Norse to claim the territory. To the Norse way of war, this was infuriating. Their combat was rooted in visibility, strength displayed, courage proven, gods pleased by blood. In battle, even in death, there was honor, there was story. But how does one sing of dying in the dark, of freezing to death in a snow pit dug by an enemy you never glimpsed, of fleeing back to your ship, not bested in combat, but undone by shadows? To settle land, the Norse needed control, predictability, the ability to build, defend, and expand. But in the White Forest, the terrain itself rebelled. The trees grew too close for formation fighting. The snow muffled both footstep and command. Rivers froze unpredictably safe one day, death traps the next. Even fire, the great Norse ally, could not be trusted. It signaled position, gave away warmth, and attracted watchers who moved like wind. And then there were the stories. Tales passed in hushed voices aboard longships or around winter hearths in Iceland and Hedeby. Stories of warbands that vanished without trace, of runes carved in the trees that changed their meaning when the moon rose, of the Wittermen, the white men, who bore no faces and walked through snow without sinking. Young warriors, eager for silver and fame, would boast they'd march into the north and tame the forest. But old men would glance to the window, to the gathering snow, and say nothing. There were attempts, of course. One such expedition was led by Ivar Skegg in 965 CE, a wealthy Yil from the coast of Nordland, who raised a force of 70 men and 3 longships. He declared his intent to carve a road through the wilds and build a hall to rival Hythabu. His last known location was recorded in a merchant's ledger in the port of Arkhangelsk. Weeks later, a Norse trapper found one of Ivar's ships floating in a narrow fjord empty. Not broken, not looted, just adrift, sails down, anchor missing, food still aboard. No sign of struggle, no sign of life. The forest had taken him. After that, a quiet agreement spread among Norse leaders. The White Forest was not to be claimed. Trade might be allowed cautiously, on Biamian terms. Gifts might be exchanged, but land would not be seized. Settlements would not be planted. Roads would not be cut. Some boundaries, it seemed, even the Vikings would not cross. And so the Norse maps stopped, their stories frayed into myth. The White Forest remained unconquered, unburned, and still whispering its warnings beneath the snow-laden boughs. It began without warning. No declarations, no war cries, no thunder of charging feet. Just a sudden absence, a missing sentry, a vanished trail, a silence too deep to be natural. The Vikings would later call it Skuggastrith, shadow war. It was a conflict unlike any they had faced in all their conquests. The Norse were masters of spectacle. Their strength was made visible in the shine of their weapons, the roar of their battle chants, the braids in their beards that marked kills. To fight was to be seen, to kill was to be known, and to die gloriously was to be remembered in story and song. But in the forests of Biamians there were no songs, there were no war horns, no enemies to see, no shields to clash. There was only the cold, the endless trees, and the creeping sense that they were never alone. Biamians did not meet their foes in open field. They did not test steel in honorable combat. They watched, they waited, they chose the moment. When they struck, it was not to fight, it was to erase. A throat cut in the darkness, a cache of food left to rot, a trail that simply vanished. The Norse mocked this, at first calling it cowardice, claiming the Biamians feared true war. But that bravado faded swiftly, because what do you call a fight where you never see your opponent? In place of war, the Biamians practiced something far older, a strategy rooted in survival, in attrition, in patience, sharpened by generations of snow and silence. There was no rush, no need for finality. The goal was not conquest, it was disruption, depletion, the quiet collapse of will. Viking formations splintered, chain of command frayed, supplies dwindled. Men who could cleave enemies in two with axes were undone by fear they could not name. And in this fear, Biamians thrived. Sometimes, the enemy left symbols carved bones, twisted pine branches, strange marks etched into bark. Sometimes they left nothing at all, and the silence grew louder than any war cry. The Norse began to suspect magic, sorcery, but the truth was more unsettling. There was no spell, only strategy. There was no battle, only the slow, cold undoing of certainty. The skald Asgrim of Wittarskog, a Viking turned monk, wrote of such a retreat. We left behind the stones with our names upon them. The drenger who carved them was taken in the night. We did not bury our dead. There was no time. We fled by daylight, for at night the trees themselves whispered. The war in Biamians had no victories, no conquests, no monuments. Only fewer returns, only stories, and a spreading silence on Viking maps. As the Norse learned, there were places even they dared not tread. To disappear was the Biamians' greatest weapon. Where the Norse were loud in voice and footfall, in presence the Biamians mastered invisibility. They made vanishing into an art form, a way of life. To outsiders, it seemed supernatural, but it was born not of sorcery, but of discipline, design, generations of listening to the land more carefully than any prayer. Clad in tones of snow and bark, the Biamians faded into the trees, as if the forest itself had swallowed them. Their garments stitched from reindeer hide, lined with fox fur, woven from bark fiber, did not shine in firelight or moonlight. They blended, layer by layer, with the undergrowth, the snowdrifts, the shadows between pines. Their movement was no less remarkable. Where Viking boots crunched through ice and snapped twigs in anger, Biamians moved on snowshoes light as breath. Their strides left barely a mark. They navigated rivers on skis built for silence, sleds that whispered across the ice like memory. Trails that a trained Viking tracker could barely read vanished behind them within minutes. Their camps were temporary, designed to leave no footprint. Domed lodges of branches and moss, insulated with snow, appeared and disappeared like dreams. When they moved, they took everything: tools, ash, waste. Even the bones of meals were hidden or crushed to dust. Viking scouts often reported empty glades that should have held life, but offered no trace of it. Disappearance was a form of control. To be unseen was not merely to evade, it was to command the terms of engagement. The Biamians chose when to appear, and only just long enough to be seen. A single figure at the tree line, an arrow embedded in a pine at head height, a rustle that suggested motion but revealed nothing. These glimpses were not mistakes, they were messages, carefully calculated allusions to remind the Norse, "You are not alone. We are not far. Even the dead were not left behind." Biamian fallen vanished before sunrise. Norse corpses, when found, were laid out in patterns, arms folded across chests, eyes open, or positioned like dancers in a ritual no one could understand. More often, they simply disappeared. Their absence became a deeper terror than any mutilation could inspire. The Norse had words for warriors, for kings, for gods of war, but they had no word for those who unmade a man not with steel but with silence. And in that silence the Biamians ruled. The forest was vast, but the snow made it infinite. To the untrained eye, the northern winter was a white abyss, a canvas that erased itself. Trees disappeared into fog, tracks vanished with a gust, the horizon dissolved into sky. To the Norse, it was hostile terrain, a place that resisted movement, resisted conquest. Every step was a battle, every mile dragged like a yoke. But the Biamians? They moved through it like wind, like memory. To understand the fear they inspired, one must begin at the feet. The Norse came prepared, or so they thought. Their boots were built for ships and fields, thick leather reinforced with wool and iron hobnails, fine for deck planks or muddy trails. But in the taiga, these boots were anchors. They sank into powder, caught on roots, froze stiff in camp. Even without snow, the damp cold soaked through, numbing toes, blackening skin. A Viking on foot moved slowly, loudly, with labor, in every stride. The Biamians had no such burden. Their footwear was not just functional, it was formless, almost ethereal. Birch-bent frames, laced with rawhide and softened with sinew, distributed their weight across broad surfaces. The snowshoes didn't crush the crust, they kissed it. Where a Viking left thigh-deep holes behind him, a Biamian left only a faint brush, a shimmer of compression barely deeper than a pine needle's fall. Their snowshoes varied by season, by region, by purpose. Some were long and narrow for speed across frozen lakes. Others were oval and short for maneuvering dense underbrush. The most feared were the hunting shoes padded at the base with animal hide turned outward, leaving no marks. The edges were rounded, the bindings dyed gray. Even from 10 paces, a Biamian could crouch in the snow and disappear. And disappear they did over and over again. Skis were another secret. Not the polished planks known from later Scandinavian sport, but crude, effective, and ancient. Single-plank runners, shaped by fire-bent wood and treated with resin and fat. Let them glide silently across terrain that swallowed even wolves. Their bindings were made of softened reindeer hide, flexible, quick to release. When needed, they could drop skis and move on foot without breaking pace. Viking raiders spoke of seeing figures cross a frozen lake in seconds, arching around them like shadows thrown by fire. Pursuit was impossible. The Norse moved as if chained to the ground. Their boots cracked ice. Their armor clinked like bells. The Biamians, in contrast, flowed. It wasn't just their equipment, it was their training. Biamian children began life in motion. Before they could speak, they were bound to sleds drawn behind their parents. By 3, they walked in snowshoes. By 5, they skied. There are oral traditions, faint echoes from distant Sami sources describing forest games where children had to race foxes on skis or cross a frozen glade without leaving a sound. Failure meant repetition. Mastery meant survival. They learned to read snow not by sight alone, but by feel. The way the crust bent beneath pressure, the color of drift shadows at dawn, the shape of melting frost around a bent twig. Where the Norse saw a flat field, the Biamians saw topography, ridgelines hidden beneath snow, ancient trails buried but never lost, the hollows of past encampments marked only by subtle sinks in the crust. Even their bodies moved differently. While Norse warriors prized muscle and stature, Biamian hunters were lean, elastic, shockingly quiet. They carried little, ate less, used momentum instead of brute force. A Biamian scout could cover 30 miles of forest in a single day and return the same night, leaving no trail but a whisper of disturbed snow on a spruce branch. They moved like animals, and that was no accident. Some ethnographic records from the late medieval period suggest that Biamians trained their gait by mimicking deer. Others studied wolves, copying their step rhythm 1-2 glide until it became second nature. They would spread weight over outer toes, never the heel, and time their breath to the hiss of wind. In groups, they moved in loose spirals or broken line formations to confuse pursuers. To the Norse, it was like chasing fog. Vikings who followed their trail often walked into traps, not of spikes or pits, but terrain. Snowfields that collapsed under weight. Ice patches so thin they could hold only a hair. Slopes greased with frost and angled toward silent creeks. All natural, all used intentionally. The Biamians didn't just evade, they led. They made pursuit into a weapon. One account from a failed Norse expedition in 991 CE records. We followed them 2 days through the storm. They left meat in the trees. We thought it was generosity. The meat made us sick. Half the men collapsed. On the third day, we found our own tracks again. We had circled, but 2 men were gone. To the Biamians, the snow was not white. It was a message one only they could read. They knew where to walk, how to walk, and when to walk. They timed their movements with the wind, the sun angle, the animal migrations. Their patrols shifted with lunar cycles. They crossed lakes only at dawn, when the ice was coldest and the shadows longest, and when they did not wish to be followed, they vanished. The Norse, raised in the loud world of sea and steel, had no answer. Their boots, heavy with frost, carried them only deeper into an unfamiliar maze. Their iron mail, so proud and gleaming in southern raids, became anchors in the drifts. Their famous endurance was meaningless in terrain they could not master. They sweated in the cold, shivered in sleep, bled into snow that drank all sound. And still, the Biamians watched, moving with the snow, through the snow, as if part of it. By the time the Norse realized they were alone, they were already defeated, not by blade, not by battle, but by footsteps they could not follow. The Viking longhouse was a monument of endurance, a structure meant to stand firm against wind, snow, and siege. Massive beams of oak and pine supported thick, sod-covered roofs. Hearth fires burned day and night. Families huddled together on raised platforms beneath animal hides, the walls echoing with song, story, or storm. It was a building made to endure. But in the White Forest, endurance meant death. The Biamians, the elusive forest dwellers who haunted Viking nightmares, built no such monuments. Their shelters were not declarations. They were whispers. To the Norse eye, they hardly seemed like dwellings at all. And perhaps that was the point. Because for the Biamians, shelter was not about standing firm. It was about vanishing. Their homes followed the same principles as their movements. Minimal trace, maximum efficiency, total harmony with the land. When the Norse scouted for signs of Biamian encampments, they looked for smoke, structure, refuse. Instead, they found moss, lichen, hollowed snowdrifts, and nothing else. Some Biamian shelters were little more than earth, dugouts built into hillsides, reinforced with woven branches, then packed with snow. No sharp corners, no protrusions, just mounds in the white. A man could walk past one in daylight, within 5 paces, and never know it was there. At night, even the smoke vents were invisible, carefully funneled through stone labyrinths that cooled the air before it rose, preventing any plume from betraying their presence. These goati, as similar structures would later be called among the Sami, were lined with furs, warmed by body heat, and could house entire families. Inside, the temperature could reach comfort even in the dead of a 40 degrees winter. Outside, the world remained silent, still, and blind. In more mobile seasons, Biamians used tented lodges constructed from flexible poles and hide, often double-walled with insulating moss. These structures could be raised in under an hour, camouflaged with pine branches or snow. When abandoned, they were dismantled completely. Peg holes were filled. Ash was scattered. The land healed. To the Norse, who valued permanence and proof, this was unnatural. Settlements were meant to be seen, a claim of space, a symbol of power. The absence of these symbols in Biamiand was interpreted not as sophistication but as emptiness. And yet every Viking who crossed into the forest knew it was not empty. They would smell wood smoke for a moment, then lose it. Hear a child's laugh in the trees, then silence. The wind would carry a scent-dried fish, pine sap, animal skin, and then nothing. Always just beyond reach, just out of view. Biamians had a name for their homeland, not a single word, but an idea. The breathing land. The forest was alive, and their shelters were lungs expanding and contracting with the seasons. Their encampments migrated with weather, game, and trade. A winter camp might become a spring trapline. A summer fishing site might vanish by autumn. They did not build towns. They moved their civilization. Archaeologists have found only fragments. A hearthstone buried 6 feet beneath tundra. A cache of smoked meat sealed in birch bark. Reindeer antler tools sharpened to a razor's edge, left beside a long-faded fire pit. Always sparse, always precise. Even in death, the Biamians practiced disappearance. Burial mounds were rare. More often, the dead were cremated, their ashes scattered among sacred groves, or buried beneath stones that looked like any other. A Viking passing by would see nothing, but if he stepped too close, he might find a carved bone left on a branch, or a totem of pine and feather turning slowly in the wind. The message was clear. We were here, and we still are. From a military standpoint, this made occupation impossible. Viking settlements required fixed infrastructure, clearings, fields, defenses. The forest allowed none of these. Clear too much, and snowstorms reclaimed the land. Build too high, and smoke betrayed you. Stay too long, and the Biamians found you first. They didn't attack with force. They simply made your presence untenable. Fires extinguished in the night. Sled dogs stolen. Supply caches spoiled. Snow shelters sabotaged, collapsing inward just before dawn. And always the feeling you were being watched from a shelter that didn't exist. There's a tale from the saga of Halfdan the White that tells of a Viking who chased a Biamian scout deep into the forest. He found what he thought was an abandoned camp. 3 shelters, a fire pit, and drying racks for fish, but no people. He waited. Night came. He fell asleep beside the coals. He woke to nothing. No camp, no shelters, no fire, only snow, and his own breath in the darkness. Some say it was a dream. Others say he had walked into a place that was meant to vanish. The truth? That was the Biamian way. Shelter was not a building. It was a condition, temporary, responsive, alive. It was not meant to be seen by enemies, only by those who knew where to look. Vikings were not strangers to violence. They had fought kings in England, burned monasteries in Ireland, and clashed with elite guards in Byzantium. They knew blood. They revered the sword. To them, battle was the furnace where glory was forged, a test of strength, will, and the favor of the gods. A Viking warrior died standing, weapon in hand, surrounded by song or flame. But in the white forests of Biamiand, there were no songs. There were no shield walls, only the clean, quiet work of killers who struck once and vanished. The Biamians did not fight as the Norse understood the word. They were not warriors in mail with banners and horns. They were hunters, trained not to clash, but to eliminate. Their world offered no room for waste, no space for error. And when the Norse came armed to the teeth and blind to the forest, the Biamians applied those same principles to them. They became hunters of men. Their weapons told the story. Not the heavy iron axes of the north, not swords. Those were loud, cumbersome, wasteful. Instead, curved knives, honed to a whisper's edge. Slender, double-pointed spears, lightweight bows short-limbed, made of birch and sinew, designed not for range but for accuracy. Arrows fletched with owl feathers to silence their flight. Tips of bone or obsidian, which shattered inside the body, designed not to kill loudly, but to kill quietly. These weapons were often dismissed by Norse chroniclers as primitive, but that was only because the Norse rarely saw them. A Viking patrol would march into the woods. They would set up camp, post sentries, and sometime before dawn, a man would simply fall soundlessly, face first, blood already black on the snow. One account from a survivor near the river Varzuga tells of a warrior named Ulf the Red. He stood beside the fire. Then he knelt. We thought he prayed, but he did not move again. An arrow thin as a reed was in his neck. We heard no whistle. We saw no one. This was the essence of the Biamian kill. No clash, no struggle. One blow, one message. The placement of wounds in recovered Viking corpses confirms this. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains from a mass grave near the White Sea revealed that over 80% of the dead bore trauma to the base of the skull, the side of the neck, or the lower back. Each wound was consistent with a strike designed to bypass armor and kill instantly. These were not battlefield injuries. These were executions. Some warriors were found without signs of a fight weapon still sheathed, shields strapped to their backs. Others showed signs of having been restrained before death. A few had their eyes removed, a gruesome act, likely meant not to desecrate but to terrify. Because for the Biamians, killing was not about conquest. It was communication. Each body left behind, if one was left at all, carried a message. To intruders it meant, "We see you. You are not welcome. You are not safe." And the Biamians made sure these messages were received. The killings were selective, strategic. They did not slaughter whole groups. They targeted sentries, scouts, officers, anyone whose death would unbalance the group. The rest were left to think, to imagine, to fear. And fear, for the Norse, was the beginning of defeat. One commander, Jarl Ingemund of Tromsø, withdrew his entire expedition after 2 nights in the forest. In his saga, he writes, "They took no more than 3 men, but on the 2nd night the horses would not eat. The 3rd morning our bread was soaked in blood. No wounds, no sounds, just red snow and a vanished fire." To many Norse warriors, these tactics seemed inhuman. They called the Biamians demons, forest spirits, or worse, unmen, not because they were monstrous, but because they broke the rules of war. There was no chance to respond, no honorable death, just disappearance. But this was not cruelty. It was efficiency. The Biamians lived in a world where a single mistake could cost a winter's food, where wounds festered in hours, where sound carried for miles. Their way of war was simply an extension of their way of life, precise, quiet, and absolute. Even the act of drawing a blade was ritualized. Knives were kept razor-sharp in oiled bone sheaths, carried not on belts, but beneath cloaks to prevent reflection. Arrows were sometimes dipped in herbal mixtures, not true poisons, but agents that slowed the blood, numbed the limbs, confused the mind. Killers carried river stones to dull their footfalls and chewed resin to mask their scent. Their breath did not cloud the air. Their shadows moved before their forms. To the Norse, they seemed to emerge from the trees themselves. But they were not spirits. They were men, raised in snow, trained in silence. And when they struck, it was not a battle. It was an ending. In the white vastness of the northern forests, there were no carved runestones to declare law, no gatherings of elders to shout judgment over mead. But there were laws nonetheless older than language, older than conquest, passed in silence, etched not into stone, but into practice. The Biamians had no need for parchment or proclamation. Their laws were lived, felt, followed not by command but by understanding. These were not laws for the ordering of society. They were rules for survival and for war. The Norse never learned them, but they learned their consequences. Those who ventured into Biamian land began to notice patterns. Men disappeared the same way. Camps collapsed in the same rhythm. The killers struck with a precision that was not just instinct, it was doctrine. Over time, whispers among monks, traders, and surviving warriors gave shape to these patterns. They spoke of 5 rules, 5 unbreakable tenets that governed the Ghost War. The Vikings could never win. The first was simple: never be seen. The Biamians did not fight battles. They erased their presence. They watched for days, sometimes weeks, before acting. To step into the open was to give the enemy a name, a target, a shape. So they became unseeable. They moved through snow without leaving tracks. They lay beneath pine roots and stared through brush so dense a raven couldn't pass. Their clothes matched the world around them. Their breath was timed to the wind, their movements quieter than falling frost. Vikings could walk past them and never know how close death had been. The second was this: kill without sound. Noise was a kind of surrender to the forest, to the birds, to the wind that carried cries further than arrows could fly. So when the Biamians struck, they did so in silence. Arrows fletched with owl feathers, knives that pierced the side of the neck or base of the skull. Death came swiftly, without warning, without drama. No glory, no screams, just absence. Sometimes the only evidence of a kill was the way a man slumped forward into the snow, his face still locked in a look of surprise. The third law was stranger and more terrible: leave no body whole. For when the Biamians allowed a body to be found, it was rarely left intact. Eyes were removed, jaws opened wide and packed with snow, corpses arranged with arms stretched to the sky or curled into spirals, animal bones laid around them like runes. The purpose was not desecration, it was doubt, a message, not to the dead, but to the living. Fear spread faster than blades. A Viking might survive an encounter, but the image of his comrade faceless, posed like a warning, would haunt him through every snowfall after. The fourth law was perhaps the most tactical: take the leader first. The Biamians observed everything. They noted who gave orders, who carried the map, who walked in the middle of the formation. When the time came, they struck not at the front, not at the weakest, but at the head. One arrow, one knife, one absence. And the Norse, for all their bravado, found that a warband without command was a pile of blades with no direction. Panic replaced purpose, and that was when the forest closed in. The fifth and final law completed the pattern: vanish like mist. The Biamians did not stand their ground. They never fought to the last. They struck and disappeared. They had routes no one else knew, paths over ice so thin it would kill a Viking in 2 steps. They knew where the tree roots formed hollow chambers, where the snow could be burrowed into and sealed behind. They did not linger. Even when they killed, they did not stay to watch. By the time a Norseman drew his sword, the forest was quiet again, unbroken, as if nothing had ever happened at all. These were the laws of the forest war: unwritten, undeniable, more effective than any Viking shield wall, more enduring than any fortress. They were not simply tactics, they were a worldview, one in which survival was sacred, one in which fear was a weapon sharpened over centuries. The Norse came to fight men. Instead, they found laws older than iron, enforced not by kings, but by silence, snow, and shadows. To kill was not enough. In the White Forest, death was not the end of a task, but the continuation of a practice, a ritual older than speech, carried out with precision not only in action, but in meaning. For the Biamians, taking a life was never casual, it was never random, it was ritualized, a process with steps, with preparation, with consequence. This is what the Norse never understood. To them, warfare was a calling of the strong, a pursuit of honor, wealth, and fame, a test of blood against blood, steel against steel. To the Biamians, it was not a test. It was a necessity bound to the land, governed by belief and shaped by ceremony. The blade itself was the heart of this ritual. They called them white blades, not for their color, but for what they represented: purity, coldness, precision, tools that, like snow, left no mark except absence. These knives and spears were not trophies. They were sacred objects. Before a hunt of animal or man, they were prepared with care that bordered on reverence. Handles were wrapped in birch leather, softened with rendered fat from a winter kill. The blade edge was sharpened with river stones, always the same stone, kept for years in a pouch of reindeer hide. The final step was a wash in pine resin or snow melt, or the smoke of dried moss, not to clean, but to prepare, to set the blade apart, to mark it as an instrument of judgment. And when the blade drew blood, it was not sheathed again, until it had been spoken to. The Biamians had no written language that we know of, but their oral traditions ran deep. The kill was followed by a whisper, a breath exhaled across the steel, sometimes a word, sometimes a name, a way of releasing the life taken, a way of honoring the silence that followed. The Norse who survived encounters with Biamian raiding parties spoke of strange behaviors in their attackers, men who, after slitting a throat, would kneel, or turn to the trees, or place their blade in the snow and wait, motionless, as if listening for something. What they were waiting for, we may never know, but we can guess. These were not acts of remorse. They were acts of recognition. The Biamians did not view themselves as executioners nor heroes. They saw themselves as agents of balance. And when balance was disrupted by hunger, threat, or intrusion, they restored it with the blade. The ritual extended beyond the kill. Sometimes, before a strike, a Biamian would mark themselves with a line of ash across the forehead, or a trace of blood from their thumb across the chest. These signs were not decorative. They were boundaries between what was before and what would come after. The hunter became, in that moment, something else, not man, not animal, instrument. Among later Sami legends, there are stories of the Sijda Blate, the pale warrior who walks without sound and leaves no body behind, always alone, always acting with cause. This figure is likely a memory, stretched by myth, of the Biamian ritual killer, not an assassin, a wielder, a vessel for justice, or protection, or vengeance. In the rare case a body was left behind, the blade would be cleansed, not merely in snow or water, but by fire, a small flame lit behind a rock or within a snow shelter, into which the blade would be passed. Smoke from certain herbs, bare root, juniper, dried crowberry, was used to lift the burden of blood. Not all Biamians performed this step, but those who did it without fail. The blade that had taken a life could not be used again. until it had been released. This was why their kills were so precise, so final. The act was sacred. Casual bloodshed would have polluted the weapon, the mind, the tribe. This was why the Biamians never raided for sport, and never left behind signs of frenzy. There were no burning villages, no mutilated livestock, no defilement, only the kill marked by ritual, sealed in silence. And when the ritual was complete, the killer disappeared again into the snow, the blade sheathed, the balance restored. The Norse, who revered open valor, who sang of berserkers howling beneath blood-red skies, had no songs for this kind of killing. They feared it not because it was monstrous, but because it was deliberate, because it was not chaos, but calm, and calm killing was something they could not understand. Even today, archaeologists uncover Biamian blades bone-handled, obsidian-tipped, buried in sacred bundles beneath the roots of ancient trees, wrapped in fur, bound with sinew, marked not with blood, but with care. Retired weapons, blades that had served and been returned to the forest, not cast aside, but laid to rest. The Norse left rune stones, chiseled declarations of lineage, conquest, and faith. They rose along roads and fjords, like the memory of thunder turned to stone. Each rune was a shout across time, a man saying, "I was here," long after his bones had crumbled to dust. The Biamians left marks too, but theirs did not shout. They whispered. These were not rune stones, not monuments, but signs fleeting, cryptic, meant not to declare but to disturb, to confuse, to warn. The Vikings called them Dothamerki death marks, strange arrangements found near the sites of vanished camps, or in the snow after patrols had gone missing, a ring of antlers around a half-burned fire, a tree stripped of bark only on the north side, with its branches bent down and tied with sinew, a crude effigy hung from a pine, head turned backward, no face. They were not meant to be interpreted fully. That was the genius of them. They were meant to be felt. Some of these symbols echoed known patterns, spirals, crossed lines, the ancient and near-universal mark of the eye, but others defied interpretation. A row of stones, equidistant, leading into a lake, a bird's wing nailed to a tree trunk with no bird in sight, marks in the snow that looked like writing, but melted before they could be studied. The Norse who encountered them responded with equal parts revulsion and awe. Some swore they were messages from the land Vatir, the land spirits of old. Others saw sorcery, witchcraft, or warnings from the dead. The more practical called them psychological warfare. And they were right, because the Biamians didn't just kill to remove threats. They killed to remove certainty. The placement of the marks was always deliberate. Just outside the camp, just at the edge of firelight, just where a man would go to relieve himself or check his snares, always discovered alone, always unexpected. The effect was cumulative. First, unease, then silence, then blame. One Viking journal recovered from the wreckage of a campfire site reads, "Someone has marked our path, not with blood, not with steel, but with something older. Thorleif says it is warning. Bjorn says it is mockery. I say it is proof that we are known, and that they want us to feel it." The symbols were not static. The Biamians adapted them. To some invaders they showed animals' predator bones stacked in reverse order. To others, inverted human footprints, carved into the snow by gloved hands. A favorite was the imitation of Viking runes. Not true messages, but distortions. Runes carved backward, upside down, out of sequence. Enough to be recognized, never enough to be understood. That was the key. To disrupt not just the body, but the mind. Even fire, that ancient companion of the Norse, became suspect. More than one group reported lighting a hearth, only to find the next morning that someone had rearranged the stones. or that fresh pine needles had been laid beside the flames, a scent meant for burial rites. Or worse, nothing had been touched, but the feeling had changed, as if the fire had been watched. This was not madness, it was manipulation, a form of warfare not rooted in steel, but in suggestion. And in this war of meanings, the Biamians had an unbeatable advantage: the forest itself. The trees were participants, not just cover, but canvas. Bark peeled in ritual patterns, branches bent to mark paths that only the trained could follow. Even the wind was used. Marks made in snowdrifts, so that when the wind blew from the north, they appeared as symbols. When it blew from the east, they vanished. These were signs written in the forest's own language, not meant to be deciphered, only to be felt. And what the Vikings felt in their gut, in their marrow, in the cold between watch shifts, was this: we are being read, and we do not know the grammar. This erosion of confidence, this slow undermining of certainty, was no less lethal than any blade. Warriors became cautious, then hesitant, then superstitious. They slept with their weapons drawn, fought among themselves, saw movement in every tree, and that was when the Biamians struck, not in force, not in daylight, but after the final sign had been left, a death rune carved into snow, melting even as it was discovered, not a threat, a promise. In the long winter stillness of Biamiand, where the sun skimmed the horizon for a few brief hours and vanished again into the hush, a boy crouched beneath a snow-laden spruce. His breath did not cloud the air. His hands, bare and raw, gripped a bow too large for his frame. He had not moved in 3 hours. His name was Elmi. He was 9 years old. His target, a snow hare, had vanished into the drift an hour earlier. But Elmi waited still, legs numb, mouth dry, heart steady. He was not permitted to return until the shot had been taken, not even to eat. Somewhere behind him, unseen but near, his uncle watched. If Elmi trembled, if he sighed, if he stood too early, he would be called back, and the lesson would begin again tomorrow, and the next day. This is how the forest trained its own. There were no warrior schools, no barracks, no sparring grounds with shouted commands. Training began before memory. A child of the Biamians did not learn how to fight. He learned how to know the weight of snow, the shape of silence, the distance between breathing and sound. These were not lessons spoken aloud, they were inherited, passed down in glances, in gestures, in ritual. By the age of 5, a Biamian child could identify the tracks of over 24 animals by shape, depth, and spacing. They knew which trees to climb when wolves gave chase. They knew which lichen could stop bleeding, which moss grew near fresh water, and which silence meant a predator was nearby. By 7, they could build a shelter with no tools, trap a squirrel with no bait, and ski for hours without a stumble. But it was not until 9, the edge age, that the training sharpened into something else. The age of solitude. Children at 9 were sent into the woods, alone, not far, not long, but far enough that the cold pressed into their bones and the shadows whispered doubts. They were told to stay a night, or to bring back something living, a fish caught with handline, a bird netted without injury, a secret learned by watching. Not all succeeded. Some were brought back in silence, carried on sleds, shivering and ashamed, not scolded, never scolded, only watched, and then sent again. The ones who learned, who adapted, who came back with fur clinging to their mittens and blood under their fingernails, they were noticed, given new tasks, new tools, a carved whistle, shaped like a bird's call, a sliver of stone to sharpen with, a bowstring of sinew made from an animal they had killed themselves. At 12, they joined the hunt, but not to kill, to watch the kill. The first kill of a young Biamian was a ritual, not of violence, but of control. It could not be made in haste. It could not be messy. It had to be done without sound, without being seen. If the arrow struck too shallow, or the knife drew a cry, it was not counted. A true first kill meant understanding not only how to take life, but when not to. It was only after this rite that the child was spoken to by the elders, not with praise, but with stories. Stories of the old hunters, of white figures seen on moonless nights, of a line of warriors who had never been caught, whose names were no longer said aloud, because they had become part of the forest itself. These were the shadows, the living memory of the Biamian warcraft. From this age onward, training deepened. Children were partnered with adults not by blood, but by compatibility, a fast child with a quiet mentor, a clever one with a stern hand. They learned the rules not of combat, but of disruption, where to strike a sled to disable it without being noticed, how to unseat a tent's supports with one tug, how to mimic the call of an injured animal, then vanish before anyone responded. The forest itself was the teacher. The human hand only guided. It taught through cold, through hunger, through endless silence. In summer it whispered through the leaves. In winter it screamed through the wind, and the children listened, because they knew the stories of the times when the forest had not been listened to, and people had died. By the time a Biamian reached 15, they were already ghosts, moving faster, quieter, more efficiently than most grown Norse warriors. Their blades were extensions of their bodies. Their snowshoes did not creak. Their hearts did not race. And when they finally joined a raid or a warning patrol, or a kill mission, they did so without ceremony, because the forest had already marked them. No helmet was placed on their head. No painted shield was given. Only a single line of pine ash drawn across the cheeks, and the words, "Now the silence is yours." This the Norse never understood. They called the Biamians soulless, inhuman, unnatural, but they were not. They were simply raised differently, raised by a world that did not forgive noise, did not reward speed, and did not tolerate those who could not listen. Elmi, at 9 years old, made the shot. The hare never moved again. He waited 2 minutes, then rose, picked up his kill, cleaned the snow from his knees, and turned into the trees. He did not look for his uncle. He knew he had been seen, and he knew what would come next. The first snows had come early that year, a slow, heavy fall that blanketed the coastal trees in a silence deeper than usual. The sea had begun to freeze along the fjord edges, and the longships were being drawn onto land, their hulls cleaned and turned upside down for the long winter. The men grumbled. They were not made for stillness. Among them was Thorgils Barebane, a man of thick arms and a reputation made in blood. He had fought in Ireland, raided the coast of Francia, and seen the towers of Novgorod smolder under Norse fire. Yet it was not the sword at his belt that made others wary. It was the stillness in his eyes, the calm, as if he had long since accepted death and moved beyond it. When word came that a trade route north had reopened a Biamian trail rumored to lead to furs, ivory, and the rare frost amber found only in the forest's deepest places, Thorgils did not hesitate. He selected 10 men, not the strongest, not the loudest, the ones who could walk without speaking, who did not ask questions, who knew that some journeys were not about loot, but messages. They carried no banners, no shields painted with serpent coils or wolf sigils, just furs, iron, rope, and a week's provisions. The locals refused to guide them. "The trail is cursed," said one fisherman. "They mark it with silence." But Thorgils laughed. "If they want to scare us, they'll have to do better than snow and wind." They left on the 3rd day of frost. The forest swallowed them within hours. At first, all was as expected. The trail wound between pines, their trunks pale as bone, and along frozen streams that crackled underfoot. The air was still, and each breath came like smoke. They spoke little. The deeper they went, the less they wanted to hear their own voices. The third night, they made camp beneath a rocky overhang. A fire was built, rations warmed, 2 sentries posted. In the morning, one was gone. No blood, no prints, no struggle, just his empty cloak, folded neatly beside a patch of disturbed snow. His name was Eric. He had said little on the journey, but Thorgils remembered he sang to himself while carving wood. The fire that night burned lower. On the 5th day they found the trail marked, not with a rune, not with a body, but with a single black feather, set upright in the snow, unmoving despite the wind. There were no birds. None had been heard since the 2nd day. Ulf, the youngest among them, touched it and whispered a prayer to Odin. Thorgils said nothing. On the 6th night, a second man vanished. Bjorn of the West Isles, a brawler known for cracking skulls in taverns. His axe remained. His boots remained. But his bedroll lay untouched. The firewood he had gathered was stacked neatly in his place. Now the men watched each other. Whispers grew. They are watching. They are inside the trees. Thorgils held them together with his silence. Not with commands, not with promises, but by sheer gravity, as if his presence alone could push the fear back. But on the 7th morning the fire pit was rearranged, not destroyed, not tampered with, rearranged. Stones pulled into a spiral, ash cleared from the center, a small mound of pine needles placed carefully in the heart. Thorgils rose first, saw it, and did not wake the others immediately. He stood staring at it, the cold creaking through his beard, the dawn light bleeding between the trees. Later that day they turned back. No one spoke the command. It happened with glances, with hands tightening on gear, with the realization that whatever lay ahead was not theirs to find. They made good pace until the 9th day. The wind shifted. Tracks they had made on the way in were now gone, not just filled with snow, gone. Trees leaned in ways they hadn't before. A bend in the river had moved. A cairn they had marked was overturned. And then, that night, Thorgils vanished. No sound, no fight, just his cloak nailed to the trunk of a tree, with one of his own throwing knives. When the others awoke, they found it swaying gently. None dared remove it. Of the 10, only 3 returned, silent, pale, their supplies gone, their eyes never meeting anyone else's. They did not speak of what they saw. They did not return to the longhouse. They slept outdoors, even in snow, and on the night of the first thaw, one of them walked into the forest again, alone, and did not return. As for Thorgils Barebane, no saga sings his name after that. No monument was raised. But among the Biamians, it is said a great warrior once came to their edge. He walked as if he knew death, and bowed to no sound. And when the forest offered silence, he listened. They say he never raised a weapon. They say he understood. So they let him vanish not as a victim, but as a choice. And in a land where disappearance is the highest form of respect, perhaps that was a kind of honor the Norse never knew. There are places in the sagas where the ink thins, where the rhythm of violence and vengeance pauses not for peace, but for uncertainty. These are the shadows, the gaps, the moments when the skalds falter, their words bending around a silence they cannot name. These moments often follow journeys north, not to the coasts, not to the rivers, but into the inland woodlands, those vast and veiled regions the Norse called the silent borderlands. Beyond the reach of kingship, beyond the range of ships, where the land grew still and the trees pressed close. In the saga of Ketil the Silent, there is a single line, buried deep in the 4th chapter. And so Ketil and his 4 companions walked into the white woods, and when spring came, only 2 walked out. They spoke no word of what they saw, nor sang, nor drank again. No explanation is offered. No monsters, no skirmish, just a blank, a narrative void. Modern historians often skim these passages, dismissing them as literary devices, the result of lost oral transitions or broken texts. But for those who know the shape of Biamian, who understand what the Norse feared most, these silences are louder than screams. In oral tradition, the sagas were not just records, they were performances. To name a place was to challenge it. To recount a death was to hold power over it. But some stories were left untouched. Skalds would lower their voices, pass over certain journeys with vague gestures, then quickly pivot back to blood feuds and oaths. The forests to the east and north, they were rarely named. When they were, it was with phrases like, the white behind the world, or the place where the gods do not hear. Sometimes, a figure appears, the snow watcher, or the pale walker, always unnamed, always on the edge of the firelight. In the tale of Haldor and the thrice-cursed axe, the protagonist dreams of a man who leaves no track, but whose eyes are in every tree. In some tellings, the axe itself refuses to work when pointed toward the north. Even in the Greenlander's record, a more factual accounting, there's mention of a failed attempt to open a fur trade through the Frostwood Path. The note reads, 5 went, 1 returned. His voice failed him after. These are not heroic deaths. They are quiet deaths, storyless deaths. And to the Norse, that was the worst kind. Viking belief held that the spoken word kept a warrior alive. That to be remembered in saga was to reach Valhalla, to feast forever in the hall of the slain. But those who vanished in Biamian were never remembered properly. No one knew how they died. No one sang for them. Their names faded. They became shadows, echoes with no source. And still, the stories remained. Even in Iceland, where forests were scarce and legend ran deep, tales persisted of white-eyed men who walked during the first snow. They did not kill unless followed, did not speak unless spoken to. And if they did speak, it was only to say, "You are too loud." It was not the Biamians themselves who entered the sagas, but the impression of them. They became something more than men, less than gods. A presence, a pressure. The Norse had no name for it, so they gave it metaphor, spirit, curse, punishment. But fear was always the undercurrent, because the Vikings, who saw themselves as masters of the sea, slayers of kings, breakers of walls, could not conquer silence, could not grasp an enemy who left no corpse, could not avenge a brother who simply stopped existing, so they avoided the story. And that, in the end, was the final triumph of the Biamians. Not the arrow, not the knife, but the fact that even the proudest bards in the north, those who sang of dragons, trolls, and the murder of gods, would lower their voices when the forest was mentioned. They did not sing of the Shadow War, because they knew the war was still happening, and that someone might be listening. It rolled in with the gentleness of breath low across the forest floor, thickening at the ankles, then climbing the knees, chest, shoulders, until even the treetops vanished into white. The Vikings had seen mist before, on fjords and moors, in the early hours when the world was half born. But not like this. Not here. In Biamian, the mist was not a weather. It was a presence. And for the Biamians, it was one of their most subtle, most devastating tools. To the Norse, it meant blindness, confusion, the loss of the one thing they relied on most in enemy lands, orientation. In forests where every tree was a twin, where the sun rarely pierced the canopy, the mist unmade even the most hardened tracker. Paths vanished, landmarks dissolved. A man could turn once, twice, and be utterly lost. The Biamians knew this. They did not fear the mist. They waited for it. Unlike most in the north, they tracked its movements across seasons, knowing which hollows gathered it first, which rivers exhaled it like ghosts in early dawn. There are oral accounts preserved later among distant Finno-Ugric cousins of warriors who could smell mist before it formed, reading the air like a deer does scent. And when it came, they did not stop. They moved. Mist provided more than cover. It gave structure. It changed how sound traveled, how light bent. The Biamians had learned to walk by echo, how a footstep bounced differently off trees, how a breath warped between drifts. They made calls, clicks, chirps, throat vibrations that bounced through fog, unheard by most, but caught by their own. To the Vikings, it sounded like the forest speaking in its sleep. In the mist, a 10-man Norse patrol could become 10 isolated men, each hearing something slightly different, each seeing a ghost that might be real. Their shield wall, so formidable in battle, was useless here. Formation shattered. They called to each other. Sometimes no one answered. Sometimes too many did. That's when the Biamians struck. Never from in front. Never with warning. One body found half kneeling, arms raised as if surrendering to the trees. Another still warm arrow through the collarbone, not a killing blow, but a message we could have. A third, not found at all. Just his boots, carefully side by side in the snow, pointed in opposite directions. Sometimes they didn't kill. That was the most frightening. They led. Through fog-thick branches, a figure might appear just for a moment. Pale, robed, distant, no sound, always facing away. The Norse would follow. Not all, but one or two. Always one. It would seem logical, close, achievable. And then the fog thickened, the shape vanished, and the man was alone. He never returned. They used fire, too. Small fires lit ahead of a Viking party, a flicker of orange through mist, a sign of a fellow patrol, or a camp, or a rescue. They were always false. The Norse would move toward it, and the mist would swallow them. When the fire was reached, there was nothing there but smoldering pine needles and a ring of footprints. Never more than 2. The Biamians understood the forest's moods the way sailors understood tides. When the fog rose quickly, it meant warmth beneath snow ready to collapse. When it lingered low, they knew ice lay thin over streams. They used it to guide their routes and to trap the careless. There's a record, scribbled in the margin of a Christian monk's map from the late 10th century, of a Norse camp in the far east. It reads, "Mist came down and we heard laughing in it. One of ours walked in and did not come out. He was not taken. He was unmade." Aya, the word choice is significant. Unmade. Not killed. Not taken. But removed not just from life, but from the map, from memory, from the shape of the world. The Vikings were seafarers by instinct. They read wind, cloud, and current. But the forest and its mist did not behave like water. It did not reflect the will of men. It bent it, warped it. Even the strongest Norse minds faltered in that fog. They clung to ropes, to each other's cloaks. They carved runes into trees to find their way back. But the mist returned at dusk, and the marks were gone. There are stories the kind told only by firelight, only when the wind outside is still of warbands who walked into mist and emerged different, quiet, changed. They stopped speaking of what they saw. They stopped eating meat. One man pulled out his own tongue, smiling the entire time. These are stories, yes, but they echo something deeper, something known even then. The Biamians did not need numbers. They did not need swords. They had the forest, and when the mist rose, it fought for them. At first there is denial. Vikings, sons of storm and sea, do not admit fear. They were raised on tales of giants, dragons, and gods who rode wolves through the sky. Their bodies were trained for cold, for hunger, for blood. They laughed at danger, laughed at death, until the forest laughed back. It never began with panic. The unraveling was slower, a fraying of nerve, the first threads pulled loose by sleeplessness, by glimpses that couldn't be explained, by sounds that had no source, by the absence of sound where there should be life. Birds no longer called. Fires took longer to catch. The men began to speak in lower voices, not by command, by instinct. They had entered Biamian with pride, with the iron scent of bravado on their breath. They sang during the march. They boasted of what they would trade or take. One had promised to return with a Biamian cloak, another with the head of a forest shaman. By the end of the first week, no one spoke of trophies. By the second, they avoided looking into the trees. It was not fear of combat that undid them. Norsemen welcomed the clash. They craved it. But in the white silence of the forest, there was no enemy to face, only things they couldn't see, questions they couldn't answer. Each missing comrade was a wound, not to the flesh, but to the mind. Where did he go? Why was there no blood? Why was his axe still in his hand? The shield wall, so strong on the battlefield, had no place here. They walked single file. They slept in scattered patterns. When a man took watch, he looked everywhere except into the dark. The Biamians didn't need to strike every night. They only needed to strike sometimes. That was enough. There is a report from an eastern expedition dated around 987 CE preserved in a Russ merchant's ledger. The commander, a Norse captain named Svertinger, wrote, "They have killed only 4 of us. We are 36. But the others, they are crumbling. I see it in their eyes. They look at the snow and see graves. They look at each other and see ghosts." He ended the note with a line scratched in with shaking hand. "We have not been defeated, but we are not winning, and I fear that may be worse." The collapse of courage is not a roar. It is a slow exhale, a slackening of grip on the axe, a slight hesitation before stepping off the beaten path, a creeping reliance on superstition, runes carved on trees, amulets kissed before sleep, prayers to gods they hadn't spoken to since childhood. One warband, once numbering 50, began sacrificing their own food to the trees. Bits of bread, bits of blood, left on stones, in snow pits, on branches. They left gifts for what they believed were spirits. Some did not even believe in spirits before they entered the forest. They did now. Commanders lost their grip. Orders were ignored. Scouts refused to go alone. No one wanted to be last in the line, but no one wanted to be first either. They drew lots. Even the toughest men began to flinch at the creak of branches. The Biamians didn't have to fight them anymore. The Norse fought themselves. There's a grim tale recorded in the margins of the Skoger Codex, a battered, partial manuscript unearthed near Uppsala. It tells of a retreating Norse band who turned on one of their own. They believed he had been touched by the forest, that he no longer slept, that he moved too silently, that his eyes no longer blinked. They killed him in his sleep. When morning came, 3 others had vanished. They never spoke of it again. By the time these groups made it back, if they did, they were not the same. Their armor was rusted, their beards unkempt, their eyes sunken. They refused to sleep indoors. They flinched at laughter. They said nothing. And when they drank hard not to forget, but to drown what had taken root inside. Fear had undone what no sword could. Not cowardice, but something deeper. A kind of dismantling of self. A dissolving of the myths they'd been raised on. The gods did not answer in the forest. Strength did not matter. Steel could not cut shadows. And when they looked over their shoulder and saw nothing, they knew. The Biamians were still watching, still there. And they had won, not by killing, but by breaking the one thing the Norse had always believed was unbreakable, their courage. The Norse had assumed the forest would wait for them, that it would watch silently as they marched through its depths, taking what they wished, setting fires as they went. They believed that if the Biamians ever struck, it would be in defense, a reaction to provocation. They thought of themselves as predators, the Biamians as prey. But the forest had its own logic, and its people did not always wait. There are records sparse, fragmentary, shrouded in myth of times when the Biamians chose not to hide, when they crossed their own lines, when they moved from watchers to hunters. These strikes were rare, but when they came with an eerie precision that made the Norse rethink everything they believed about who controlled the edge of the world. One of the most whispered stories is The Night of the Ice Bridge, a tale half chronicled in a Rus trader's personal ledger, later copied by Byzantine scribes. According to the account, a Norse trading outpost had been established along a frozen inlet in what is now northern Karelia, a seasonal encampment of wooden huts, stockpiles of fur, and a half-dozen ships moored in the ice. It had been a quiet winter, no signs of trouble, until the night the snow turned black with soot. Without warning, fire bloomed across the ice, not from torches or oil, but from small concentrated fires lit under the ships, a tactic unthinkable in a land of deep snow. The flames melted the mooring ice just enough to crack, then freeze again, trapping the hulls in jagged fingers. The next morning, 3 warriors were missing. 2 sled dogs had been gutted. The food stores had been salted, not with brine, but with bitter herb that soured every bite. And in the center of the camp, standing upright, was a single ski pole, carved with marks no Norse could read. It was not retaliation. It was a warning, and it had come first. These proactive strikes were always small, surgical, never mass attacks that would have betrayed the Biamian way. Instead, they would observe a threat gathering, a new trail being cut, a forward camp being built, and they would preempt, not to defeat, but to redirect. They struck not at strength, but at intent. There is evidence, both archaeological and textual, of outposts burned before they were finished, settlements that never grew beyond a single longhouse, stone foundations laid out in the forest, never built upon but marked with strange soot, scattered bones, and signs of sudden abandonment. One such site near Lake Onega contains dozens of discarded iron nails, never used, and a half-burned crate of imported salt abandoned mid-storage. The story told by the ground is simple. They came. The Biamians came first. Then the Norse left. Some of these strikes weren't violent at all, not in the traditional sense. They were psychological incursions. A Biamian's hunter might leave a bundle of fresh kill just outside a Norse camp, perfectly skinned, still warm, as if to say, "You're in our hunting grounds. We still eat. You will not." Others reported hearing singing, not Norse, not any known tongue, distant, melancholic, always at the edge of camp, never closer, always at night. Even worse were the mirror attacks when a Norseman went missing, only for his exact gear to be laid out in his empty tent at dawn, clothes folded, boots beside them, even the talisman from around his neck, placed gently on his pillow of furs. These were not just warnings. They were tests, to see how the Norse would react, to see which bands would fall apart, which would stay, which would attempt vengeance. And when they did, when the Norse struck back, when they marched deeper into the woods, the Biamians were ready, because they had made the first move, and now the board was set. It's tempting to see these attacks as acts of war, but to the Biamians, war was not a state. It was a rhythm, a change in wind, in silence, in scent. If the land shifted, they shifted with it. If a threat grew, they pruned it. No declaration was needed, only preemption. In this, they were not aggressors. They were gardeners of balance. And when the Norse dared cut too deep into the forest's flesh, the Biamians struck not in anger, but with the detachment of those who had done this before, those who had always done this, And when the strike was done, a fire, a disappearance, a silence left behind. The forest closed again. The snow smoothed over footprints. The wind erased the fire's scent, and those who came after would find nothing but frost and confusion, and perhaps the feeling that the war had already happened before they ever arrived. When steel met silence in the white forests, it was not just two peoples in conflict. It was two worlds, two ways of seeing, two systems of meaning that could not recognize each other and therefore could not coexist. The Norse came from a world of expansion, of conquest. To live was to build. To build was to leave a mark. Longhouses, cairns, runestones, even graves were declarations. They cut forests to shape land. They named every place they settled. Even their gods were builders, breakers, givers of fire and fame. To the Norse mind, space was to be shaped, nature was to be tamed, and war was the arena in which meaning was made the clash of strength and fate, where a man might meet the eyes of Odin with blood on his hands and pride in his chest. But the Biamians lived in a world that did not need shaping. Their forest was not a resource. It was a body, a teacher, a god. Where the Norse saw timber, they saw breath. Where the Norse saw wilderness, they saw home not to be altered, only to be understood. In Biamian worldview, to conquer land was to kill it. To build upon it, without invitation, was to invite imbalance. Their structures were designed not to last, but to pass seasonal shelters, buried caches, pathways erased by snowfall. They lived not for memory, but for continuity. To live well meant leaving no trace because the land, and those who came after, should remain untouched. This clash of values became more than a misunderstanding. It became war, not over territory, but over philosophy. The Norse couldn't comprehend the Biamian refusal to meet in open battle. They took it for weakness or fear, but the Biamians saw battle itself as madness. Why would you stand and fight when the land offers other answers? When the storm, the cold, and the unseen hand are more precise than any sword? Even death meant different things. For a Viking, to die with weapon in hand was sacred, a gateway to the afterlife, a way to earn song. For a Biamian, the best death was unknown, unwitnessed, returned to the forest, without debt or wound. They did not glorify violence, but they practiced it with the clarity of those who know when balance demands it. There's a phrase recorded in one of the few translated Biamian oral fragments: "The deer does not boast of its flight. The snow does not grieve the blood." To the Biamians, killing was not victory. It was necessity. And the Norse, for all their strength, became proof of imbalance. Loud, bright, hungry, they brought with them fire, iron, and ego, and expected the forest to yield. Instead, the forest responded, and the men who lived within it responded as the forest had taught them, not with rage, but with rhythm. They did not charge the Norse. They bled them over time, not to punish, but to restore the silence they had broken. Even stories changed in this conflict. The Norse sagas began to twist when they spoke of the northern woods. Warriors who once boasted of their own boldness began to speak of dreams, of trees that breathed, of footsteps that echoed behind them with no source. Gods were silent. Runes lost their meaning. Glory dimmed in the snow. Some warriors began to adopt foreign charms, pine needles tied to belt loops, birch bark etched with unknown marks. They did not say why, only that it pleased the forest. They had begun to bend, not in conquest, but in submission, not to the Biamians alone, but to the idea of a world that could not be grasped, only obeyed. There were those who tried to bridge the worlds, traders who learned Biamian silence, offered gifts at the right stones, walked barefoot across snow as a sign of respect. Some succeeded, briefly. They were remembered as those who walked light, but most never understood, and the war, quiet, persistent, and unrecorded, continued. It was not a war of armies, it was a war of ideas. The Norse brought fire, the Biamians brought silence, and in the heart of the forest it was silence that held. Maps do not always record the reasons behind their borders. They show rivers, coasts, mountain chains, the geography of permanence. But they rarely explain absence. They rarely ask, why does the road stop here? Why was this land left blank? Why did no outpost rise in this valley, where the soil was rich and the game plentiful? In the case of Biamian, the answer is silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows fear. The Norse expansion, so bold, so wide-reaching, touched nearly every corner of the medieval north. From Vinland to Byzantium, the wake of their longships carved new patterns into the world. Fortresses were raised along rivers. Trade hubs bloomed along coasts. Entire regions were restructured around their influence. But not the White Forest. Not Biamian. Look at any early Scandinavian map. You'll see settlements curling around its edges like the fingers of a hand unwilling to grasp. Towns with names rooted in fire, water, gods, and iron. And then, beyond a certain line, only vague marks. Unsettled, unmapped, dangerous, or worse, nothing at all. This was not an accident of geography. It was a scar of memory. The Biamians never fielded armies. They never razed towns. But their resistance, precise, quiet, and enduring, left a mark on Norse ambitions more permanent than any battle, because it reshaped not just routes, but minds. By the early 11th century, Norse traders began avoiding inland paths through the north entirely, favoring long, exposed river routes, even when it meant greater risk from rivals. Trade missions were redirected, settlements abandoned, planned colonies scrapped with no formal explanation. One merchant letter from Birka, dated around 1012 CE, laments, "We shall not return through the pine, shadowed trail. The men do not sleep there. The deer do not come near. The forest watches, and it forgets nothing." This shift altered not only commerce, but politics. Kings and jarls stopped funding exploratory expeditions into Biamian territory. What could be gained was not worth the cost, not in coin, but in men who returned broken, or didn't return at all. Even alliances were shaped by it. Norse leaders who once scoffed at the silent men of the East began quietly recognizing their boundaries. Tribute was sent through intermediaries. Passes were requested, not taken. In the court poetry of the time, verses once filled with blood and conquest began to speak of omission, the wisdom of restraint, the pride in knowing where not to go. One skald wrote, "The wise do not wake the snow that sleeps beneath pine root. Some halls are not meant to be built." But the silence reached further than trade and politics. It changed the Norse themselves. Stories told around the hearth began to include warnings not just of trolls or draugr, but of the unseen ones. Warriors began wearing forest charms on their raids. Children were told not to speak in pine groves unless spoken to by the wind. The cultural memory of defeat, a defeat without a war, entered the bones of the people. This may be why so many Norse accounts from later centuries blur the Biamians into myth. It was easier to call them spirits, wraiths, demons, to say they vanished because they were never real rather than admit we could not conquer them, because that truth would require an even harder admission, that some lands do not yield, that some people do not break, that silence, if wielded with patience and knowledge, can hold back empires. The Biamians left no great monuments, no ruins for archaeologists to wonder over, but their influence was profound. They taught the Norse, and by extension, the wider world, that not all frontiers were meant to be crossed. That victory could look like restraint. That survival could be a kind of sovereignty. and in doing so, they reshaped the map, not by marking it, but by making others stop right there, at the edge of the trees, where the wind grows cold and the birds no longer sing. The forest remains, not as it once was. No portions have been logged, rivers redirected, roads carved where snow once erased every step, but its heart still beats. In the remote corners, where the maps blur and the wind still howls without trees to break it, the white woods of the north endure. Beneath the canopy of ancient spruce and pine, where moss swells over stone like breath, the land still remembers. And in that memory something moves, not seen, not named, but felt. The Biamians left no monuments, no towering ruins to crumble beneath ivy, no altars to mark their rituals. They left no tombs. Their silence was their legacy, their greatest strength, and their lasting footprint. And that silence has outlived empires. What they left behind was not physical. They left boundaries, invisible lines drawn not with sword or blood, but with fear, precision, and myth, lines that the Norse, for all their fury, would not cross again. And to this day, there are places deep in the northern taiga where locals still refuse to settle, not from superstition, but from knowing, a wordless instinct inherited like the color of one's eyes, a sense that this place belongs to someone else. The Biamians may be gone. Perhaps they were absorbed into other tribes. Perhaps they retreated further still, deeper into a wild that now exists only in slivers. Or perhaps, as some whisper in the far north, they never left at all. They simply folded themselves back into the forest, into its rhythms, its sounds, its dreams. Their traces are subtle, a ring of stones long covered in moss, still warm in winter, a birch tree with its bark carved just slightly differently, facing a stream no one remembers naming, the absence of birdsong in the morning fog, a pair of footprints too small, too narrow that vanish into a snowbank and do not come out the other side. No one claims these things, but those who live nearby learn not to ask. The echoes linger most in stories, not the written ones, but the ones shared between generations, the ones told in hunting lodges or whispered beside firelight in reindeer skin tents. They speak of Skuggamen, the shadow men, and the Hiljothir, the quiet ones. Sometimes they appear in dreams, not speaking, only pointing. Sometimes they are glimpsed in blizzards, striding effortlessly through snow too deep for any sane man to enter. There is no agreed description. Because they are not seen, they are felt. A sudden urge to stop walking, a shiver not from cold but from realization, a memory that does not belong to you, of a forest you've never walked in, but somehow remember. And always the same feeling, that if you speak too loudly here, something will hear you. And remember, that feeling is the last gift or warning left by the Biamians, a people who did not demand memory, but shaped it by what they denied others. Even modern archaeologists admit the absence. In satellite maps, there's a curious pattern. Clusters of Norse sites spiral around certain zones, as if something kept them at bay. Radiocarbon dating confirms it entire centuries where no settlements appear in prime land. Trade trails that veer in strange arcs. Bones found near forest edges intact, unlooted, weapons beside them, faces turned toward the trees. It's not proof of Biamians, but it's the shape of a missing hand, one that pushed the course of history without ever showing itself. And yet, sometimes, they are remembered. A carving here, a song fragment there, in old Sami chants, a name whispered only at solstice. Iskat, the still, a figure said to walk without shadow, whose feet do not stir snow, whose gaze causes fires to flicker out. Children are told not to stray too far in the woods, not because of wolves, but because he may be there. And if he sees you, truly sees you, he may not strike, but he will follow. and he never forgets. That story, told in dozens of variations, echoes the truth at the core of this long history. The Biamians did not seek to rule. They did not claim the land with iron or ink. They claimed it by living so deeply within it that it answered on their behalf. Their war was never truly against the Norse. It was for the balance of the forest. The Norse simply became a threat to that balance, and were answered accordingly. And so the Biamians passed into legend, not with a final battle, not with a fall, but with a withdrawal so perfect it became indistinguishable from myth. And yet, what they achieved endures, not in borders, but in memory, in behavior, in hesitation. That hesitation, that flicker of doubt before stepping into certain woods, that lowered voice, that offered token at a tree's base that is the monument they left behind. No need for stone, no need for song, just silence, and sometimes that is enough. So if you go there, truly go and find yourself in a clearing where the snow feels untouched, where the trees lean in slightly, where the wind hushes itself and the fire dies low, remember what came before. Step softly, speak less, and if you see a shape watching from between the branches, don't run, don't speak, just bow your head, because you may have wandered into the place where the forest remembers, and in that place the whispers never stop. They echo forever